Right, welcome everybody to a special edition of the JUXT cast. Tonight we have a special guest, or two special guests actually. The first special guest we have is Dominic Monroe.
Hi, everyone.
An older, Dominic was on season 1. And a new guest, we have Ray. Hello, Ray.
Hello, Mark.
Ray McDermott of Defn Podcast fame as seen on TV.
It's seen on TV, yes. If we're counting YouTube as TV these days, we have got a few videos up there.
Yeah. Well,
check out the back catalogue, guys.
Yeah, Defn Podcast is one of my favourite podcasts of all time, especially with all the Clojure content.
It's getting less and less by the episode these days. Yes.
Right.
But I've come here to talk about Clojure and its future.
We're going to talk about Clojure's future, but we're going to talk about a special project that you've been working on, Ray, called the REPL-acement. Do you want to introduce it and tell us what it's about?
I'm not quite sure I've got a fully developed pronunciation rule yet, but yeah. It's called replacement, but it's spelled REPL-acement because the idea is that it's going to replace all known Clojure editing environments. So it's replacing Emacs, replacing VS Code, replacing IntelliJ.
So before we get to how you're planning on implementing it, what was the thinking and experiences that you had that led up to this kind of idea? It's a great name. I mean, I think we brilliant name. But is there anything more behind the name, and how did you get the idea?
It's basically coming from a project I've been doing for a while, which was a kind of joint REPL thing that I did for the YouTube channel that I'm involved in, apropos. And we wanted to do some live coding. And to do that, you have to have a REPL browser-based environment at the front end so you can all share it. Then it has to connect back to a REPL at the back end. And this all worked, but there were some problems with it. And I'll go into that in a minute, why that sort of floundered. But over time, it gradually dawned on me that, in fact, you could kind of evolve this idea with a few tweaks and a few changes. And sort of, if your scales fall from your eyes, you could kind of see this shared REPL environment as being a bit further. You could start to persist the REPL sessions. You could start to log into it. You could start to share the code and stuff like that. And then I might have started thinking, okay, yeah, well, you could do that for REPL sessions, which would be great. But could you do it for projects? Could you do it for actual code that you wanted to run as well? And that's the kind of next level thinking that I've been doing around replacement.
So is this a collaborative experience that you envisage?
Eventually, yes. I mean, the idea is to try and make it single use to begin with, but overall, collaborative has to be the way forward. Eventually, it would be any kind of pairing session. It can be a kind of casual collaboration, or it can be a collaboration over time as well. And that's the other thing I want to talk about is that, once you've kind of got a bunch of tools that are distributed in space and time, then you can collaborate in any one of those dimensions, essentially.
So what does it look like? I'm using this tool and I'm editing some Clojure. What's the experience?
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear that this is very early days. It's just at the sort of beginning stages of the development. There's a sort of roadmap and a plan, but I can tell you what it's like now, and then I can tell you the sort of plans for how it should be looking over time. So one of the reasons, or one of the problems I had with, I think it was called Reptile, the first one, which was the idea of the shared distributed live environment. The problem there was while we were doing the show, the apropos show, we'd find that like after half an hour of shared editing, that the forms would get large. We'd suddenly be running out of memory essentially in the code mirror, or performance out of the code mirror that was using to drive the front end. And so after you got about a couple of pages of REPL content, it became unusable fundamentally. So it was like, oh my God, this is a total nightmare. But the guy who did Code Mirror has rewritten it. Code Mirror 5 is now sort of legacy, and Code Mirror 6 is now something which is being rewritten in a functional style, actually. He's rewritten it in, he's using JavaScript, but he's used a functional style to essentially have an immutable editor. And now everything can go super fast. And the people at Next Journal, Martin Kavlar especially, and Matt Herbert and people like that, I'm sure I'm dropping a few names that were involved in it, but these guys have now brought it back into the Clojure space, put a wrapper around it for the Next Journal and Clark and stuff like this. I worked with Martin as well, actually, to get it working for replacement. So we can now use Code Mirror 6. And that allows you to edit the whole of Clojure core. You can just bring in any massive amounts of namespaces. And so the editing experience, the sort of speed, the things that people were complaining about with browsers. I'm not going to say it's as fast as Emacs or as fast as Vim or, something like that. That's all subjective to some extent. But it's certainly good enough. It's fast enough that you're typing into the browser window you're not feeling any lag occurring. So I haven't done the full-scale benchmarks on this thing, but from a user perspective, at least, it feels fine. Yeah, it feels good enough.
Yeah, that's a good question. Are we going to see the end of is the Vim Emacs war finally going to be resolved?
Well, as long as there's Vim bindings.
Well, of course, these are all possibilities, and you can make Emacs bindings and Vim bindings, and CodeMirror has all these things sort of built into it already.
Yeah.
So, yeah, absolutely. That's just key bindings, shortcuts, etc., to make it more productive, and I think there's every reason to do that.
It is amazing, how all of these browser-based code editors, in the last few years, have sprung up all over the place. And you would never have imagined being able to use a browser as an IDE before. But now you go to GitHub, you press dot, and suddenly you've got basically a VS Code in your browser. So it definitely seems much closer to the realm of possibility now than...
You've been playing with an editor. Is it something TipTop?
TipTap. Yeah, I mean, that's based on ProseMirror, which I guess is sort of similar to CodeMirror, but these things are quite difficult to manage. So doing that is probably one of the more difficult front-end components to make a rich text editor, because they have to use the content editable API, and it's pretty horrible. But TipTap or ProseMirror or CodeMirror, there are lots of foundations that people can build on now that do all the funky stuff.
So replacement uses CodeMirror.
Yes.
And what have you added to make replacement?
On top of CodeMirror? Well, there are various things. I mean, CodeMirror is just a kind of an implementation on a browser. This is an important thing. For me, it's not really the fundamental aspect of replacement. I mean, it could use ProseMirror. It could use any other editing front end. The main thing we want to do is have a protocol between some backend service, like I was mentioning in the shared environment. So some backend service which can do persistence and processing of the text and processing of the data and, storing it in a immutable database. I mean, if I back up a little bit, I would say that the general idea is to say, where are we with Clojure today in terms of web applications? What's the dream Clojure environment? It's kind of like a Clojure script front end with some embedded editing like ProseMirror or CodeMirror or whatever mirror. And then it's some Eden or transit data exchange over a WebSocket, talking to some Ring-based server or some Mali-based server or whatever, rated site to name drop the hosts. So that and
table stakes, right?
But actually then plus something like XTDB.
Yeah.
So you can have essentially the code really stored in the database. And this is the thing that I'm really interested in, is looking back at the work that Rich did for Codec to see how we can leverage some of those bits of thinking in the modern Clojure stack.
Do you want to take us back and explain what Codec was about? Many of our listeners will have known who Rich Hickey is or know a bit about Clojure, but what was Codec? Dominic, I mean, you remember Codec.
Yeah, Codec was Rich's project to allow you to do analysis of Clojure code over time. So it was integrated with both Git and Clojure. I think there are still plans for a Codec 2 even that uses Tools Analyzer or something along those lines rather than the read-based method it uses now. But the idea was just to load a bunch of information about your code base into Datomic and allow you to start doing queries about how it's changed over time. I think there was I'm blanking on the name of the book now. Your code base is a crime scene. I believe that was an inspiration for the Codec, and they were really trying to pull out data and visualizations that they could use to show the growth of your code base over time, that sort of thing. I don't know how much use it actually got. And like you said, it's a fairly unknown project of his, but it is quite cool.
It was cool. And if you go back, and I'd suggest that the listeners do this and look at Codec and look at the README, and they say basically, this is an interesting idea and it can spawn all of these potential future projects, one of which is a sort of IDE. And, so I think they had all the ideas around doing it. An interesting thing about Codec, which was kind of slightly missing from your description there, was the fact that they wanted to do something different to Git. Because the problem with Git and all these kind of text-based systems is that they're line-oriented, they're not code-oriented, they're not semantic to the language. So this is another thing that I'm interested in with replacement, is saying we can dispense with all of this stuff about timelines around Git because that's a boring way of viewing changes over time as far as we're concerned. What we want to see is the evolution of the function, of the var, of the namespace. So we want to have like a contextually semantic, rich environment for Clojure. Now, I am really thinking about this as a Clojure first, Clojure only environment. Could it be eventually used for other languages? I don't know. To be honest, at this stage, I don't really care. But I think that's for other people to think about, because at the moment, I think it's worth considering how we can enrich the Clojure environment and the Clojure editing experience way beyond what we've got in terms of features and capabilities in the existing editors.
Yeah, and sometimes when you're thinking about these hard problems, it pays to travel light. You don't want to have the burden of saying, well, let's do this for every language or for all the mainstream languages, because some of the languages don't lend themselves in their design to this kind of approach.
No, but I think once we get a protocol, an ability to turn code into data, and this is the other thing that I'm doing, by the way. If I go back to Codec and stuff like this and projects like that, there was another project around about that time in the editing space called Lighttable. And there's a very famous Clojurian called Chris Granger that did all this. And they even got some money for it. But it kind of died on the rocks because they ended up trying to broaden the scope to lots of languages. And so that kind of project, it did actually end up on the rocks because it sort of grew a bit topsy. The scope grew too much. But also, I think the sort of technology that's lying on the ground today is much more powerful in the Clojure world than it was 10 years ago. It was like a huge mountain to climb, and I think in general, the idea of sort of building an IDE, something like Cursive or VS Code, it seems like the enterprise of a huge company. It feels like 100 developers kind of project. But I don't think that's true for Clojure anymore. I'm kind of already in the business of making a UI, and I can make a network protocol, and I've got all the stuff from you guys, thankfully, to make a database and persistence layer. So, you can kind of get a lot of the stuff, not exactly for free. You have to make some insights for this to happen. But once you have some of these insights and, I'm working on the insights of the previous people, like Chris Granger, like Rich Hickey, then it's a bit easier, because you're picking up these ideas. A bit like people are doing from the 1980s, like you're doing with temporal databases. Some things that weren't possible in the 1980s now become possible because we've got more storage, we've got faster computers, blah, blah, blah. Likewise, Clojure's more than 10 years old, and some of the things that are achievable now in the ecosystem are much more powerful than the things that were achievable, even 5 years ago.
Yeah. I think it's interesting to bring back this idea of a REPL, because if you're a Clojure programmer, you know instinctively what that experience means. And it's very difficult to explain to somebody who's not used to kind of the instant feedback or the tactile environment of working with computing that a REPL gives you. If you're somebody who might be working in DevOps and they're used to a feedback loop of minutes or half an hour, to work with a kind of evolutionary environment where you have ideas and you can see the results of those ideas. I mean, even today, I was demonstrating something in Site to Alex and something wasn't working. And I was, why is it not working? So I had left this def in my, in my code somewhere. I just kind of got the request and I was able to dive into the request and find out what the name of the key was and sort of play around with it. All live, right? And something that just cannot be done in other programming environments. I really like the idea of being able to see, even kind of what I've done in the last session, that Git that forces you to sort of stamp kind of, I'm ready now, I'm going to back up, stroke commit, stroke kind of push my changes. You get in this sort of flow where you're only giving people a snapshot of what you were doing and you don't get them that continuous sort of recording of seeing your thought patterns almost, and allowing people to inhabit that and be part of that thought process and see it live. This idea of, well, we would call it separating code from time. You're kind of untangling those two things. Rich talks about place-oriented programming, and that, in a way, it's the place that we talk about is the Git repository. And even though we have a history and we kind of, we don't have that continuum the REPL experience gives us.
Yeah, I think there's two ways of looking at this. Obviously, there's the way of looking at code over history. If you've got a namespace or something like that, then that's some evolution of code that's existing in that namespace, and you want to be able to track that, find bugs, etc. But you're right, there is a sort of the session, and there's every reason to keep that session. And again, you could imagine we're just scratching the surface of these things at the moment. Is there innovation around keeping that session around? Can you use that session as a learning mechanism, as a playback, as a testing tool? There's all sorts of possibilities here, which, I frankly admit that I've not explored, but I perceive it to be something which is potentially of interest. The other thing that's really interesting to me as well is not going around this sort of thinking about tools namespace and stuff like that, which is kind of interesting. But I feel like the problem with tools namespace is that it's kind of like it's parsing strings, as it were. And I don't want to go that way because I look at the tools that are in Clojure now and I see that there are mechanisms to conform data and there are ways to conform Clojure itself.
For our listeners, do you want to kind of expand
Oh, right,
on
okay.
what conform means.
Right. Okay. So yeah, back it up to spec, basically. Yes.
And you might want to explain what spec is.
So okay, maybe it's Dominic can do that. Actually, give me a break. He's the technical one.
You're gonna have to give me a moment while I'm mentally just processing all of your complaints now about how spec conformers aren't bidirectional in core, and now I understand why you were so upset about that.
But I've got them that they are now, so it's okay.
So, is there a minimum version on your tool of like Clojure 1.11 because the specs are outdated, or are you using third-party spec?
They're patched. Sorry, but
okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Monkey
backing,
patched or core patched?
Backing up, monkey patched, I'm afraid. Yeah, but yeah, backing up a little bit. Let's talk about spec.
Yeah.
What's that? How's that lying on the ground?
That's a loaded question, isn't it? So, how many years are we going back now with the release of Spec Alpha?
It's about 5 years, I think.
Really, 5 years. So 5 years ago, Core decided that they wanted to take on validation as a problem. I think in particular, macros are a pretty high concern around making sure macros are receiving data in the right shape, but obviously validation is general purpose. You can put it anywhere. One of the big ideas behind it was that code is already data, so we don't need to have datafied specs. So like Plumatic schema had done before, where your schemas were maps and you could merge them and assertion, well, we've already got data structures. And by doing that, we get full access to predicates. If any of you have ever used schema and tried to wrap a custom thing so you get a nice message out and all of that stuff, you know the mess that is all of those protocols underneath and how horrible it can be to integrate with. Spec said, we're not going to deal with any of that. What we're going to do is just say, predicates in, that's the whole system. So yeah, Spec is a validation library. It's still in alpha. A couple years ago now, Rich did a big talk about the potential for Spec 2, which I believe had a little bit of attention on it. I think stalled out recently, but I don't think that means it's done. It's just still incubating. I guess we need to cover what a conformer is, don't we? It's one of those complicated parts of Spec. So a conformer, it's a thing that you're not supposed to use in Spec for the most part, for starters.
Oops. I don't think you can say that. I think anything that's in Spec is usable. So I don't accept you're not supposed to use it.
When I say you're not supposed to...
I'm sorry to interrupt your narrative there.
No, it's good. I mean, it clarifies what I'm saying, which is I think it's often abused for things that it shouldn't be abused for. So there was a lot of use of conformers to do coercion. So people were trying to use them to automatically...
What does a conformer do then? What is a conformer?
It allows you to transform the data in some way as part of the validation process.
I think the main thing about conformance is that you put some Eden into it and it conforms it into data. I think that's the major difference, is that Eden or syntax, especially code syntax, is a different form of Eden to the actual maps. So that's what conforming
So
really
if I
does.
have a string with a number in it and the spec says that thing has to be an integer, then a conformer can turn
so
the
this
string.
is the time you're not supposed... This is what people do with conformers. This is why you're not supposed to use conformers.
Well, I won't do that then.
Don't do that.
And why not? Why is that?
Because you start running into problems. I want to distinguish these two values, whether it's actually a string that's been turned into a number or if it's actually a number at different parts of your application. And there's no way to do that because the conforming process is fully automatic. And you start getting into problems with like this key can sometimes be a string and be valid on the way in. Like I've checked that it's valid. When I ink it, it's supposed to be a number. Why am I getting an exception about type error string? Well, it's because a string is perfectly valid there because of the way you've written the conformer.
But it's worth saying that a conformer operates on a spec.
Yes.
So it's not independent. You write a spec and then you basically ask whether a particular input conforms, or you use input that is matching the spec to conform it. It gives you back essentially a conformed version of that data.
But the conformers also run as part of the validation process. So I believe the main use cases in Spec itself are actually very different from where people actually took conformers. The main thing it's used for in Spec itself is when you expand out an OR, you name the different branches. And also there's another main case as well. So there's a couple uses like that where they're really expanding out the data to explain it. And this is where I think you are using conformers for, is as a parsing mechanism to get the named areas out rather than as a coercion mechanism. So when I say you're not supposed to use conformers, what I mean is don't use them for coercion. You probably don't need custom conformers. They are there for the rare cases that you do, but very rarely But I believe Ray is in the green here because he's seen Alex Miller's warnings on Slack. I know that you're aware of all this.
No, but I mean, I think it's, a lot of these things is worth like looking at, like you said, the green path and the idea of conforming stuff. Actually, I watched a talk by David Nolan about this, about how Spec could basically be used to reinterpret ClojureScript. So, this is not something which is a novel idea of mine. But the other thing that's interesting about it, there is a corollary to Conform, which is that you can take an Eden form like a Defn or a def or a let or whatever, and you can ask it to conform to a spec. These things are spec'd out by the core team as well. So they're not my specs. These are specs that Alex and Rich and Stuart, they've made them and they maintain them. So the idea is that I will take some Clojure code and ask it to conform against the spec that they've written. And what that does is it produces a map, essentially. It produces real data. So it's not just like, this is sort of, what should we say? There's a kind of legend or a myth that we were talking about at the beginning there, where code is data, data is code. Well, it isn't kind of really. But with Spec and conforming, it actually becomes real data. It becomes manageable. It becomes data that you can manipulate. And why is that interesting? Is that there's another part to Spec. So you can conform it out to data, but you can take that data and unform it, which is a weird word, because you're actually reforming it, in my opinion. But it doesn't matter. Naming is hard. So, it's like, so you unform that data back into Eden, back into an actual executable bit of Clojure. And this is interesting because it gives you some sort of space in between those two activities. In between the conform, where you get data, you can now manipulate that data, use all your kind of Clojure skills to change that data any way you wish. You could do aspect-oriented programming. You can add println, you can add a tap, you could change the name of the variables, you could do all kinds of refactoring. And then as long as you give back something which will be unformable, essentially, then you're all good. You've honored the contract, essentially. The contract is the spec of def or defn or let or whatever. So that's nice, isn't it? Because you can really treat it as data and use all standard sort of Clojure data manipulation tooling on your code.
And that was the original promise of Lisp, I guess, when you were trying to explain the advantages of Lisp to a C programmer, because you would say, well, in languages like C, you have to compile it to this abstract syntax tree,
Right.
AST, and then the compiler would then manipulate that AST and be able to transform it into, object code, machine code, and often not be able to go the other way around. I mean, I suppose an AST was really just the compile tree, and you could probably walk the tree and produce the code again.
But the abstract tree is not available to developers. That's the problem. It's a hidden value. That's one of the wonders of these technologies, isn't it? It's no longer kind of a second-class citizen.
Yeah, the programmer gets to deal with the source code, but the programmer doesn't get to influence the compiler. And then even if they could, it's a one-way transformation generally.
Yeah, if you think about how AOP works in Java, for example, people typically, the aspect J and things like this, is they use like bytecode manipulations. They either put proxies in front of them or they do other kinds of things to alter the behavior. So they haven't got the ability to literally alter the code. Now, I'm not saying that AOP is the only use case for this or the best use case for it or that it's even legitimate. But I'm just saying that having code as truly manipulatable data is a useful quality, I think. Even from a data storage perspective, it makes it interesting because if you can break down your code into actual data, then it makes storing it as a document something which is really kind of useful, explorable, searchable, and indexable, and all these kind of things.
Right. So as a data structure, if I've got a function and I make a change to that, I can then diff that change. I can express that in data. I can compose that data. I can transform it and play around with it and analyze it.
Exactly. You can really see it, whereas it's difficult to explore Eden, and it's difficult to explore it as a sort of, well, what is this Eden? Defn has a special meaning. And again, like going back to Codec, the reason why Rich was interested in doing that was because you wanted something which is semantically aware. So you can do that with code as data. You can literally add on all kinds of tooling around that data or interpreting that data that you couldn't do with just plain Eden. You'd have to interpret it using something like tools. Now, tools namespace in the end has to bottom out to something like this.
Yeah.
My perspective of it to the people that are doing all the tools namespace work, and it's really great work for all this like, linters and parsers and stuff. It's a bit of a shame that we're not using a canonical mechanism to get the code into data. Now, the core specs aren't as perfect as they could be and they don't have all the information or the metadata. But I think for me, using these specs as a way to get things into data and then use these kind of intelligent tools around what the data is, that would be a good place to start putting those tools rather than actually reading the Eden as such.
Yeah, I think actually one of the exciting things to me listening to this is, I think mentioned it earlier, but diffing code instead of GitHub and having a PR or using Git, and you get this sort of line-wise diff of the old file and the new file, and you have to work out what's actually changed and what's just sort of been re-indented, or like, for example, if someone's taken a function and they've added like another arity to it, so now it's a 2-arity function, because they've had to like insert an extra pair of parentheses, then the whole thing is just sort of a big blob of green and red. Whereas if you had this code as data, maybe you could even come up with a description, like a textual description of a diff, and it says, change the arity of the function foo to be 2 arities. And then
absolutely.
That would be really, really cool if you could then have like on your phone, you get a notification, someone made a PR and they renamed a load of functions, but they didn't actually change any code. And you can go, okay, well, whatever, approve, go to the pub early. But.
Another thing that's come up recently for me, which says file systems make lousy databases. And so what we're talking about here is, what would a database for a code base look like if we want to store it in a data and be able to query it and manipulate it and things as we can in databases, whereas file systems are just like, hey, this is my file, and then I can break my file into lines, but that's kind of it. And then Git works on that. We've been talking about, I don't want to keep talking about the project side, but the project side has a similar view that file systems make pretty lousy document stores for web servers, right? So when you store a file like index_fr.html, the HTML kind of indicates as a clue that it's a media type called text HTML, and there might be a byte order mark in the thing that indicates it's in UTF-8, maybe. And then there might be the _fr that indicates that it's in French. But these are all heuristic clues and sort of hacks, because the file system itself cannot be a sufficient or satisfactory repository for the metadata that you need to store. So you need to hack it in some way. It's an
impoverished environment.
It's an impoverished environment. And it seems like that more and more we did decide to standardize on file systems some time ago. Yeah. And the Unix operating system is built on this whole notion of everything being a file.
Yes.
And maybe that was a misstep. And the success of the file system has actually led to a local maxima, a cul-de-sac that we find ourselves in.
I mean, the way I think about it is that it's fine for things to be files, but like you say, not everything. It's clear with rich data. Forgetting the Clojure world for a moment, if you look at JSON, it just doesn't work with pipes. In the past, if you were looking at data, you'd have like line-oriented data, you'd have CV, comma-separated values, you'd have the mainframe kind of like Unix of the 80s and 90s and even 2000s, I guess. You'd have everything as line-oriented with carriage return line feeds, etc. And it was all fine. And you could use Unix tools around those things because they were all oriented around that as well. So it wasn't just about things being files. It was about the notion of pipes and sockets accepting line-oriented files. And to Alex's point earlier, this is not the world we're living in anymore. We're living in a sort of rich data world, which has, maps, arrays, numbers, and strings, and they can go on different lines, and they can be rearranged arbitrarily. That's fine. It's no problem, because the idea is that the interpreter is an interpreter of that data. It's not some random interpreter. Maybe it's a callback to Alan Kay, if you like, that you send an ambassador. So you do need some kind of interpreter of this data, and whether it be an Eden parser or a JSON parser or whatever. These things just don't work anymore. You can look at JQ, and JQ is not a command line tool, in my opinion. It's pretending to be one. It's got flags and stuff, but, you can't really be an honest broker about that and say, yeah, that's a command line tool. It's just like every other command line tool. No, it's not. So I think the gig is up, the jig is up, whatever people say. So I think we have to think about proper data, not just this line-oriented stuff.
Yeah, line-oriented is great because it's vanilla. You're going to code lots of stuff in line-oriented files. You can save everything almost, apart from binaries. But, that is the strength, certainly in the Unix file system, strength that you can do a lot with just one level of nesting, or one level of, granularity. A file has many lines. But the problem is you don't have the recursion, a line, that's it, that's the leaf. You don't have
maybe I should just, sorry, go on, Alex.
No, I was just going to say, it's just like, having a key value store as your database, and it's very convenient and easy to use, but then sometimes data is more than just keys and values. And
yeah, the values are actually interesting as well.
Yeah.
You want to look into the values and not just have a blob, because that's what in key value storage end up being, isn't it? It's just like a bunch of blobs, and then if you go to these key value databases and they end up indexing into those blobs. Yes. Anyway, what I was going to say, the other thing I was going to say was about editing. to your point about diffs and stuff like that, is you want to be able to have an editor. And I know this is very annoying to people who use Vim and Emacs, but you want a graphical editor. And I also think that VS Code, by the way.
You want a graphical editor.
I want a graphical editor. I think the world wants a graphical editor. I'm prepared
Except
to,
Dominic.
I'm prepared to accept that there's a few people that don't. But, I think a lot of people do want visualization around their code. They want all kinds of like tips and tools. And, a lot of people don't. I mean, they're experts, and you can always turn that stuff down. But the problem with the kind of line-based editors, disparagingly called mainframe editors that we have now, is that they don't have that ability to turn things up. They can't turn on a rich environment. They can't turn on like images. They can't turn on alt text or graphics, and everything that they do is kind of pretense at that. So I think with the browser, you have a huge amount of capabilities, most of which are not being used for our development environment yet. So I think that selfishly, at least for me, as maybe not a great programmer, and I would like more help from my environment. I'd like more visual assistance to see what's going on, rather than just like playing computer all the time. I'd like the computer to do a bit more work, to explain things a bit better, and to show more obviously and more evidently how things are. And also I want to embed kind of training materials, images, videos, all these kind of things into that kind of editing experience that is almost impossible to do inside of any of these editors.
Yeah. And if you look at like the early web, I mean, the early web was all just sort of plain documents and you read it and that's basically it. And nowadays you look at the web and there's like these full-blown applications. You hover over something else pops up, or you like use your keyboard to navigate, and you've got Kanbans and video editors and all this sort of crazy application stuff in the browser. And I think the same thing could definitely happen with editors.
I was going to point out that sometimes I kind of hark back to, when I started using Emacs, it was 1.18, and when it goes up to, I think it's 1.28 now. So I think, that's progress. But then I started using Emacs in 1991. And I think, does that actually point to the strength of the idea, the power of the idea of the file in the line? Or does that really reflect the stagnation in the industry that we find ourselves in?
Well, I think what you were saying earlier on, when we were out earlier on, was that the heart of Emacs was Lisp. It's the ability to essentially hack on the editor. And I think that idea is something I don't want to give up on. I definitely want to have something which can be in any browser, and you can have any front end. You can evolve the front end. It can be completely hackable because, again, it should be data and it should be a code editor of some type. The fundamental unit of the code is some data, is some text, essentially. Clojure is essentially a text-based environment, so we are going to be editing text. I'm not going to try and deny that. And I'm not trying to invent a new language. I'm not trying to say that we should use something like Unison or something like that. Although I will say that they have a good idea in terms of granting identities to vars and to functions and to defs and stuff like this. And I want to carry that forward. So I think it would be a really good idea to have UUIDs or some kind of synthetic identity for a function so you can track it in a database like XT, for example, as well as looking at the Git Merkle tree stuff so you can find, recursive hashes of functions and namespaces, which again, funnily enough, Git doesn't do this. Git stops at the file level. Git sort of Merkleizes files, but it doesn't know anything underneath it. So it can't Merkleize functions, for example. It can't Merkleize vars or stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about code, but we also see this in documentation, because a lot of the documentation we write in JUXT is Markdown. And it's very frustrating the way you want to make a reference to a paragraph and that paragraph moves, and you want to be able to do cross-references and sort of track histories and what you wrote. And often you want to quote something. Now, when you quote something, you copy what the person wrote from their document. And if that document changes, you just, you're stale. The opportunity to bring documentation or knowledge to this as well is huge.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Notion and Rome and all these people have been doing with basically turning text documents into the database and having them all be documents in a graph database, like some data log thing.
Yeah, we said before, Alex, if we move.
Yeah, but I mean,
and then change to Postgres.
Yeah, but the point is that you can do the same kind of thing. I mean, and the people at Next Journal are doing this for Clark. They're starting to do this in terms of their editing experience. But I want to take it a bit further and make the whole editor like that. Maybe I should ask my own question, because
how are you going to do it? How are you going to do it? How's it done?
Yeah, exactly. How are you going to do it? What's happening?
It's
here?
almost like you host podcasts. Like,
I just think it's drying up, so I'll just ask some questions to myself. No, then. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely a bit of a hobby at the moment, and it's going to remain like that. But I started up talking to various people online about it, and some people are quite interested about it. We've got a little Discord channel going, but after a sort of initial excitement, to be honest, it's kind of like, the embers are sort of just glowing in the distance. But I think that's partly because I ended up on a Discord channel. And why did I go to a Discord server? It's because like this Clojure in Slack was so unreliable, blah, blah, blah. But now the Clojure in Slack is kind of on the pro plan, and it looks like it's going to be staying that way for a while. I might come back to the Slack world and start to sort of invite more people. And obviously the back of this podcast, it would be interesting to see if more people are interested in joining the project. So I'll start up a channel there, and I'm doing some bits and pieces on it to make it a viable, like kind of top to bottom proof of concept of this stuff. I've already tweeted a few things about how the editor works, but I'm now in the throes of making that persistence in reframe, and also I'm going to make that persistence against a remote database. So that's what I'm planning in the next month or two. And then in June, I'm going to do a workshop at clojureD all about replacement. So this is kind of like announcement of that, actually. So thank you very much for this opportunity. So that would be good. So one of the things I'll be looking at is to get volunteers for that workshop to hopefully help to gain some enthusiasm about the concept, and maybe to take it up to a few more contributors and get some more people involved.
we've covered a lot of the concepts underneath the implementation.
Yeah.
What can I do with your editor other than just like mash on CodeMirror today? That I
Nothing.
do
Nothing, absolutely nothing. This is in the sort of primordial swamp at this moment, so you can't do anything. I can't do anything.
I think I'd like to applaud Ray for challenging conventional wisdom and challenging these very kind of received wisdom that you can't build another editor because it just takes too long. It's like there's a lot of things like you can't build a database, you can't build a broker. I mean, these things are just too complicated. And there's a kind of palpable lack of ambition that has arisen in the industry for, for a long time. There was definitely, I think, time in the 90s where it just felt Microsoft has sewn everything up. Everything was going to be Microsoft. And we kind of broke out of that, resurrected Unix, or, Linux came along and it challenged that. But I think that challenging the status quo, challenging the received wisdom and trying new things, being aware of what's happened before, but then sometimes some ideas of the past, they just didn't work because their time wasn't right. And we talk about, that like bitemporality. We say, bitemporality is an absolutely core and essential idea. And the reason why people don't talk about it is because the time to implement bitemporality just, the resources and the technology just wasn't ready for that idea. But the idea is important nonetheless. Do you think about that, in terms of where we are in the industry, what other kind of sacred cows are there to challenge?
I mean, I'm generically kind of down on a lot of things the industry is doing. I think we're going in many ways the wrong direction, especially things like the cloud. I think it's a complete disaster for civilization, if I'm totally honest, because I think the idea of a few small companies owning all of our technical infrastructure is an absolute disaster for humanity. So, I could go that far, and I'll call names. Google and Amazon, as far as I'm concerned, are, a bad. I'm not saying that the people who work there are bad at all, but I think it's a bad outcome where we've got so few providers of these kind of solutions. And it's becoming more and more difficult to escape them. It's like a kind of gravitational pull towards these environments. If we talk about sacred cows, there's a lot of gaslighting, even amongst ourselves, around that these things aren't too bad, or these things are solving our problems for us, they're making things easier for us. Yeah, maybe, but I think that's gaslighting. I think they're not making things easier for us. I think they're making things easier for themselves, and we happen to come along for the ride. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be easy to get out of this situation, but I see a lot of companies, smaller companies that are rising up to do bare metal servicing, to look at network provisioning, peer-to-peer networking. And we spoke earlier about the fact that a lot of peer-to-peer networking is problematic due to ISP infrastructure. So I'm not saying that these things are easy to change, but I definitely think there's a lot of stuff in the industry that's going in the wrong way. I also think, by the way, that on the other side, things like blockchain and cryptocurrencies are a good thing, Now, I'm not saying that Bitcoin is a good thing or Ethereum is a good thing because they burn up the planet. And of course, that's dumb. There are better ways of proving that you've got some investment in your coin than burning up energy in fossil fuels or whatever fuels. I think that's pretty crazy. But a lot of the concepts around cryptocurrencies, around decentralization and around smart contracts are going to be something that could potentially rescue us from this centralizing environment that we're stuck in right now.
I mean, I agree. There are things where you have monopolies, and given that it's late at night and we're all having a rant, looking at Microsoft Office and what Microsoft did to create and maintain that monopoly, even to the point of settling some kind of court cases by offering to donate their products to schools and kind of train that. And I've been into schools and I've seen that kids are being trained on the same technology that hasn't changed in 30 years. Now, if you think about the changes in technology in our lives, that 30 years, this is going back before the internet. You think about the innovation, right? And then you just go to some organizations where there has been no palpable improvement in their computing experience for 30 years. And that's a staggering waste. And for what benefit, right? The pockets of a large multinational company, in Seattle, Redmond. And this will happen with the cloud, right? That we all kind of stagnate on the same, we'll have, object store, Elastic, S3 and things. But in 30 years' time, everyone will be tied into this mode of operating, but nothing new can come along because it will just be closed out.
Yes, exactly. Sorry, Dominic, I could rant all night, but I don't want to do that. I'm trying to talk about replacement, not about these other things. So, Dominic, you can have a rant now. What are you upset about?
My rant is very similar to Malcolm's as well, in that I feel like as technologists, we've let humanity down. Even through the COVID situation, I've got a neighbor, he's got a sight problem and he couldn't even see the homework he was being sent, let alone the fact that however many people didn't manage to get an internet connection, didn't manage to get a device, didn't manage to get online to do their education through the lockdown because the local councils were sourcing it from major companies. And we've got British National even, Raspberry Pi. You can get a computer for £99, less than that, plug it into your TV at home and you're good to go. And we're worrying about we don't have enough money to send these kids computers and the price of computing is coming down and yet we're unable to supply. We're failing as technologists. And I see this all throughout levels of society in the way that we've built a system that encourages our family's user data to end up in the hands of one company, Facebook, who will then manipulate them to absolutely no end. Right? We see our family members getting scammed because of insufficient protections on these platforms. We see them buying things that they wouldn't normally buy. The Facebook scandal that always stands out in my mind is when they're allowing advertisers to target depressed teenage girls. That's a very vulnerable group. And we've enabled this as technologists. I just think basically big companies bad. That's how it stands today, right?
I don't want to say that big companies are always bad or that people that work in them are always bad, but I think part of it, to be totally honest, is about the subjugation of governments. And I think the governments themselves have somehow felt like they can't control things. And the American government is not regulating the industry anymore. I understand that Silicon Valley don't want regulation. That's natural. A lot of companies and a lot of environments don't want regulation, but at a certain point, they become a public utility, like you say. They become so universal that you need regulation. I'm not saying you should shut them down, but you need to make them put their feet to the fire in terms of their ethical behavior and their ethical standards. There's a gentleman called Nick Clegg that used to be in government with David Cameron as a spineless person, if ever there was one, who's in charge of ethics, essentially, at Facebook. I mean, this guy he hasn't got an ethical bone in his body. So, it's kind of bizarre to me that these people are now, it's an Orwellian present, in fact, not an Orwellian future. So I think the governments do have a role to play. The EU is...
GDPR is fantastic.
Well, there's all sorts of small arguments about it, but the point is they're asserting their ability to regulate the environment, and that is a powerful thing. And it's starting to happen in California as well now. And I know that there are some justices, some people involved in the FTCA in America. So there have been some good appointments recently. But it takes a long time for the governments to regulate these corporations. And these corporations have got huge sums to throw at the lobbying machine. To me, that's one of the huge problems is that, when we were talking about this earlier, this conflation of the law, politics and technology. It's sort of coalescing into a single thing. And we have to start dealing with it as citizens, not just as technologists.
On that bombshell.
Yeah. Well, I am curious to see if I can use it. I've had this idea for a while around, we organize our code bases into files, and there's always arguments about, well, how do you structure your namespaces in Clojure? We argue over how we're going to organize our functions into namespaces, and do you have a controllers and models namespace? Do we do MVC or, logical domains or whatever? And I think the real answer is, it depends on what you're doing. If you're a database admin, you actually do really like those models files, because you can rock up and you can say, okay, what's querying the database? How is it querying the database? Why have I got this really slow query running? And you can make adjustments. So you want a very specific view of your code base, which is I want to see all the model functions, or I want to see all the places that interact with the database. But when you're an application developer looking at registration or authentication, you just want to live in that world, in that folder of authentication. But you can't have both views. They sort of live independently. If you've got data, all your vars are in a database, you can do a query and sort of produce a false file, essentially, and say, these are all the models, or here's all the places you call a JDBC query, and you create tailored views depending on the work you're doing.
Yeah, we have one hierarchy in code, and everything else is called a cross-cutting concern.
Yeah.
We don't really...
And we build principles around it. So this is a single responsibility principle, and this is one responsibility for this namespace. We've built a whole world of rules around how we structure our code. And I think it misses the point, which is that the human element is important. It's what you're trying to achieve in that moment is what matters. And that's what replacement, if it's datafying all your code, it has this opportunity to start doing.
Well, I think that's exactly right. Definitely the idea is that it should be an open environment to do queries on. In fact, that's one of the most important aspects of the project for sure.
There's a conference coming up that Jeremy's talking at called Have You Tried Rubbing a Database on It? We talked about really the move from the power of the database vis-a-vis the power of the file system, and how maybe the file system has had its day. This is just one example of where we're trying to think about database techniques applied to, in this case, coding.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's data, and then you have databases. I mean, I think first we have to get to the data.
Databases are better than code bases.
Well, maybe databases are the new code bases. Yeah, I think that could be the way of looking at it. I know you're wrapping up, but I want to just go back to something that I remember from Codec, which is important. Typically, when you're editing code, you tend to have a repository view of things. You tend to think of things like, I'm looking at my repository, and I've got a repository for this and for that, and I've got dependencies on this, and I've got dependencies on that. But all of these kind of things are essentially, they're all a contribution to your project. I think replacement should be looking at the project and not caring about the dependencies or things like that. It should be looking at, what is actually on my class path? What is usable by me? And by the way, that's another thing that Rich talked about a long time ago with things like version management and tree shaking and stuff like this. And I know that this is something that GraalVM does, is it gets rid of classes and stuff like this. And it's something, again, which once you've got data, once you've got an ability to understand what your application is actually composed of, you can just dispense with all the stuff that's not touched. So you can get a perfect view of your application and not think about it as separated into 15 different repositories. So I think that's another important aspect of thinking about things in a kind of holistic model rather than a sort of sharded, fragmented, But then, like Dominic says, you can build up perspectives on those things because it's a completely open set.
Yeah, I guess the one other, ranting is the waste in the industry. I connect to this point about Richard Key's, you talk about version management and the idea of going directly to the code function and the version of the code function rather than the version of the jar file or the project repository that the jar file was created in or something. Now, people don't know the origin of the jar file, and jar file is an archive in the Java language. The origin of the jar file was when we used to write applets. When Java came out, you would compile Java to classes. And the way the web worked then was that you had to load each class off the network individually. And in those days, you didn't have a thing called keep alive in HTTP, so that would be a new connection. So what would happen is that you would be waiting for your super applet, and you deploy the thing to the website, and you'd be waiting half an hour for the applet to load. It would have this, latterly it had this kind of nice Java logo, but before it was just a blank grey screen. There was no network tab. You couldn't see what was going on. It was very frustrating for people. And then there was an optimization that Sun kind of invented, which was, if we just somehow use the tar archive format, that's why jar is zip. Basically the tar.
Zip.
Well, it is zip, but the command line comes from the tar. But the idea, that's why the flags are the same, tar, CVF, jar, C, that's.
Right.
But the idea was put all the classes in a tar file, and we'll call it jar because we can then put some metadata on there for the version things. But that's where the jar came from. So it was there to solve not a code dependency problem. It was, in those days, you like chuck files all over the place. We didn't know Git, right? It was there to solve a very temporary problem, which was a perfect storm of very, very slow networks and the problem of applets and loading all the classes individually, right? Which any of those would have been solved by loading classes over, keep alive or, pipelining or server push or, any one of those. But no, they decided jars. So then from that point, everything was then copied and pasted wastefully. And everything was then packed into these large containers. And then a small amount of waste is then multiplied until you've got this kind of vast class paths that you're only using 0.0001%. That's really the story of the industry. And I joke with my son about how computers have got slower over the years. They used to be really fast. It used to be that when you want to play a computer game, you took a cartridge, you chucked it into your Atari, you turned it on, and you played the game. Now you have to wait 2 minutes, flight simulator load to load this, or get online and you turn your computer on and it's, I've got a Windows update. I've got to wait half an hour. Every generation of console that comes out is that much slower than the previous. And what a horrible thing it must be to, be a gamer today, the amount of time you have to waste. This theme that the industry, that actually the waste in the software world has always overtaken the efficiencies of the hardware world, which is a bit of a joke, but it's just actually death by 1,000 cuts. It's just these poor engineering decisions that add up and multiply that mean that everything is so slow. How slow some websites are. It's just...
And then there are these people who are putting editors into their websites, making them really slow.
One of the things I would say, in defense of me, is that I think quality of life should improve, but not through waste. So, I think there are certainly things that can get better. There is so much waste. It's incredible.
I think just in defense of the front end, in the last couple of years especially, people have started to notice. I think that React came along in 2012 or maybe a bit before that, and then at the height of its popularity, like 2014, 15, that's when all of these websites were just so bloated and you would download 10 megabytes for your doctor's surgery booking form or whatever. And I think in the last few years, like you've seen big frameworks like Next.js run by Vercel and all of their features on their new versions. We improved our build times, we rewrote our compiler in this Rust-based thing or whatever. And speed does seem to be a lot more important, and efficiency, and hopefully in terms of the general computing sphere with the ever-increasing climate threat and that sort of thing, people are taking it a lot more seriously, and the government is hopefully introducing more rules so that people aren't just mining bitcoins all the time. But maybe I'm being too optimistic there.
No, I think this is one of the upsides of stagnation, right? Is that as you start to get stability, you can start optimizing around that stable base that you have. That's why we have incredibly efficient JSON and HTML parsers, because it's everywhere. It has been for 3 decades now at least. So it's worth optimizing. And the same thing for Vim and Emacs, whereas Atom has been heavily criticized.
Yeah. The amount of work that Microsoft has put into making Electron not slow for VS Code is incredible. It kind of sucks that they have to put in so much work just to make Electron not be terrible. But at least, it is one of the few Electron apps that doesn't hog every resource your machine has to offer.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a very interesting point about maybe stagnation is the answer. That we everything slows down and let us just, we've made it right. Now let's make it fast. And we need everything to stop. But I think a lot of it has crept up on us, right? Our hardware is much, much faster. The opportunities are there. Yeah. I would offer, along with kind of Bitcoin and Ethereum, can I be controversial and say continuous integration? Like I make one change to my source code, not even a comment. Right?
And a minute ago, you were so upset about Bazel and its caching system, which avoids all of this.
I wasn't. But, I think that caching is part of the answer. But, the fact that people quite narrowly go along and they want to build the entire system again because I made one change to one comment, that captures an attitude, right?
But that comes back to this thing that Rich was talking about and Stu talked about as well, which was that you should be able to have a sort of checked in or digested view of testing, for example, so that rebuilding artifacts should be fine, but it should be a cheap activity. But you don't have to test everything because you kind of know that all these code paths, they're already clean. You know that you've tested them. Definitely opportunities, that's for sure. And I think your tool does some of that as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly what Bazel does, or what we do with
But we're not talking about that. We're talking about replacement.
Sorry.
But one of the things I was going to
Might's all
say,
ambiguously referred to.
what I was going to say was part of the sort of like stagnation versus stability thing is I'm going to challenge that because I don't think that these parsers came through stagnation. I think they came through the desire of a big company to reduce its internet bill. The fact that essentially Google wanted to own its own browser, now it's a dominant browser. So why does it make things faster? Well, it wants to improve its JSON parser because it's of its Gmail stuff. So I don't think it's an altruistic, or I don't think it's anything to do with stability or anything like that. I think it's purely to do with speed of their applications and their own things. And in the same way as we benefit as Clojurians from their investment in V8 and stuff like that, then, we also benefit from these JSON parsers. But it's a purely kind of side benefit, I think. It's not an altruistic activity, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, HTML is probably the odd example out there. Maybe XML would be a better example. But I also think some of the optimizations we're starting to see in JavaScript land are coming from the fact that JavaScript is finally slowing down a little bit. There's a lot more opportunity for tree shakers that are getting more and more sophisticated, start breaking down bundle sizes and start analyzing what of this can be run on the server, what can be run on the client, that sort of thing. And it's because it's not changing every single week anymore.
But a lot of those things, you look at the technology, like Babel, I think it is one developer that wrote that. It wasn't some big corporation that funded him for a year. It was just one developer that wrote the thing. Okay, it caught fire, but back to your point about big ambitions, that he didn't know it was a problem. He didn't know it was difficult to do or something wonderful. Just saw the problem and thought it was bullshit and fixed it, and then got himself a job for life, I guess.
One person developing that. I mean, that's a common meme that OpenSSL, that most of the internet infrastructure is kind of built by very, very small numbers of developers and is monetized multi-trillions of dollars by large corporations. And there isn't a balance, right? There seems to be those two extremes and not much in the middle, right? Where is the investment coming for sustainable, organic, maintainable tech? It seems to be that you either have to have huge pockets and deep, corporate sponsors, or you're kind of working completely unpaid.
My viewpoint in terms of there's a few things I would do to fix the internet. Tomorrow, if I was the king of the internet, there's two things I would do. Number one is I would make the companies open source all their code. I don't think that should be a problem. All their code is in Git, just open source it. And that would do two things. Number one, it would make it clear what they're doing. Lots of eyeballs, their competition would be shitting all over each other. Excuse me, bip, bip. But, it would be fun and games for a few weeks. But definitely open source it. That would be number one, because having all their algorithms hidden behind these shields of secrecy is a disgrace, in my opinion. We could regulate them. We could look at them. We could find out opportunities to regulate them. And we could find out what evil they're doing, basically, or what good they're doing. I'm sure some of these engineers are doing good things and, it's all fine. But there's certain pockets of that stuff that would be genuinely horrible, as Dominic pointed out earlier.
Not if they're all using ML to do their horrible algorithms, then they don't even know what they're doing.
That in itself would be interesting. That in itself would also be informative to me. So, number one, open source all of your code and all of your environment. And it's a pretty simple fix, I think. They wouldn't like it, but I think it would be pretty
you could start by saying that.
Don't start by compromising. We just do it. That's number one thing. Yeah. I'm the king. We do it. Okay. And then the second thing that we do is we turn off customized ads.
So no surveillance of any kind for any justification for ads or anything. You just don't do it.
They can make ads. They're just not. They just can't be localized.
So they're context sensitive. They're sensitive to the content rather than the.
Yeah, so they can be sensitive to some sort of broad geography.
What about you're on Amazon and you buy a car and it suggests certain types of tires because you've just bought a car? Is that an ad or?
That's fine. That's not surveillance. That you've bought the thing. So it's
no. I mean, it is if they know that you bought the thing from another website.
Oh yeah. If you bought it from Amazon. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So you bought a car from Autocar or whatever, and then you go to Amazon.
No, that's horrible. That's obviously a horrible problem. Yeah. And these kind of things, if you open source them and you get rid of these personalized ads, then that kind of thing breaks down. And again, certain people will be out of a job, but I don't care.
Yeah.
Because
You're king of the internet.
Yeah.
I'm king of the internet.
You've got all the king's chicken you want.
Yeah. As a vegan, I would definitely refuse the king's chicken. But yeah.
I would sort of go so far as say, well, which is less far than you, but public bodies should only buy open source. So it should be a complete ban proprietary software in any public body, including NHS, right? I mean, there's a huge fiasco with, in the Irish government where their health authority had a crypto ransomware attack, closed down all the hospitals, operations were cancelled and things like that. And it was all because they were buying Microsoft, because obviously they don't tell you in the papers, but it only happens when your SMB, 43 port is open. And, it's a very, very bad IT practice to buy. And because they're doing it because Microsoft just has the NHS by the balls, right?
That's Ireland by the balls with the tax arrangements as well.
Well, yeah, that's true. But that is the least indirect. But I mean, Microsoft run the NHSX, that they are with all the lobbying and things like that. And it's completely boohoo, start sorting it out, making it open source. How many billions does the NHS receive for just its IT?
Yes.
Why don't you make an NHS Linux distro? Number one, right? You can make a Linux distro with 5 people full time. You could make a proper one with massive amounts of opportunity for people making medical apps. You have a whole economy with companies producing open source, vetted, audited. All of this stuff, all this economy could be bootstrapped by the NHS. What do? They don't. They just give money to Microsoft. So they're just in this, no sympathy at all.
I have a feeling that the theme of this podcast is boiling the ocean, solving the world's problems.
Stop moaning.
You've got to have some.
Placement has a lot of power, doesn't it?
I mean, you started it, Ray.
No weight on your shoulders.
King of the world, of course. But honestly, I think that's just a start. But that would make a very, very different.
I agree completely. Yeah.
Well, I guess we should probably start to wrap it up. What would you do if you were king of the internet? That should be a series.
Absolutely.
Give people the power. I mean, don't actually give them the power, but see what they would do.
Just to finish up, we've got the regular Toy of the Week slot. So Rodecaster Pro, what are the pros and what are the cons?
The pro is in the name, and couldn't think of one for cons there. It's just a box, and we don't have to plug a laptop in and set up Pulse Audio, and we just have it here in the office.
That was a bad... Oh, come on, Alex.
Sorry. We don't have a laptop, and we don't have to set up anything on Arch Linux at all. Sorry, was that worse?
Well, we have a box now. We're big fans of hardware. We can put the mics into, and we can have the different levels, and it saves everything to an SD card. It's all hardware, and we have every track that goes into a card. It's called a Rodecaster Pro. If you're thinking about putting a podcast together, we highly recommend it.
Yeah, and it's got buttons, and I can press them. If I say a funny joke... Oh, wait, no, that's the wrong... There we go. There we go.
So should we give ourselves a round of applause?
So authentic.
I think that wraps it up. I want to say thank you very much, Dominic and Ray, for joining us.
Absolute pleasure.
It was lovely to have you. Lovely to have a meal and to put the world to rights. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks.